Anyone wants coffee or tea? Help yourself.
Olena, how are you doing?
Thank you. We're doing good. Do you hear us? Can you hear us?
Yes, we hear you perfectly. Ambassador, nice to see you. Do we know, and Pam, nice to see you. Great. I think we have a quorum, and I think we're also. I know we have. I think it's Joel Sinclair in Ottawa joining as well.
We're also waiting for Hlib Vyshlinsky, but he will join us very soon, so we can start.
Okay. Okay, great. Well, good morning and good afternoon to our speakers and participants, and also moderators as well. We're live in Washington, Kiev, Brussels, Ottawa, and I know that there's a bunch of people who are joining as well via video conference that won't be able to weigh in, but are watching in Europe, in North America, and elsewhere. So we really appreciate your participation. I want to just first off just really thank our speakers as well, and we really have a dynamic lineup of speakers today, but also our partners, the Ukrainian World Congress, German Marshall Fund, U.S.-Ukraine Foundation, Friends of Ukraine Network, Reanimation Package of Reforms, Ukraine Crisis Media Center. I think the list keeps going on and on of those that have been participating in these task force events. My name is Jonathan Katz. I'm a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund. I'm also one of the co-founders of the Transatlantic Task Force on Elections and Civil Society in Ukraine, along with my partner Orest here as well, and Adrian, who have been leading a task force here in Washington that has looked at and focused on democracy, civil society, and reforms. I just want to thank everybody again, all of our partners. Today's event is to focus really on Ukraine's reforms. And obviously we're in the middle of an election season, both presidential, parliamentary in Ukraine, that are going to determine in many ways what reforms will be not only passed, but also implemented. This task force was set up as a means to communicate between key capitals and key partners of Ukraine with Ukrainian civil society, citizens, and government. And the ultimate goal, and I think it's shared by all of the participants in Brussels, Kiev, and Washington, is to support Ukraine's transition, democratic transition, to strengthen Ukraine's security and engagement with the West. And obviously, we've had a challenging few months from the Sea of Azov to even recently issues such as the acting health minister carrying out reforms. And as someone who's worked on these issues from a U.S. government position and outside, we know how difficult they are and what it means and takes to actually help Ukraine and serve as a real partner of Ukraine and Ukrainians in this process. So thank you for being here. I'm really actually deeply appreciative to the representatives from the United States, Canada, and the EU. When you look at Ukraine, supporters of Ukraine across the board, especially over the last 5 years, and I'm not even talking about the previous 20 plus years, where all of these actors, the United States, Ukraine, and Canada have been there. But over the last 5 years, I think it's incredibly impressive in terms of both the billions of dollars provided in assistance, macroeconomic support, political support, I think in the most difficult circumstances. So I just wanted to just say, our deep appreciation for the work that you're doing and the support you provided. So today we're going to look at these reforms, what reforms are necessary, but also, what are the limitations of partners of Ukraine, especially in an election season, in terms of these corruption court, to state-owned enterprises, to changes to the electoral system.
There they are.
The community in Ukraine and Canada, Ukrainian Canada, that has played such a significant role as well. Pamela Tremont, who I know from the State Department, is the Deputy Chief of Mission, U.S. Embassy to Ukraine. Also in the role that you are in, you oversee, play a central role of overseeing assistance in addition to keeping everything running for the U.S. government in Ukraine along with the ambassador. And obviously, we really appreciate you and your leadership as well. Peter Wagner, who I've had an opportunity to work with, he heads the Ukraine Support Group for Ukraine, the European Commission, EU DG NEAR. Peter has long been engaged and has been one of the leading voices, both in Brussels, but also in Kiev and here in Washington, that people turn to when we think about what reforms need to take place in Ukraine, but also the importance of the EU to what's taking place in Ukraine, both from the macro financial to the reform end. We also have Jill Sinclair, who's coming in, I know is one of the leads, Canada Global Affairs. I hope you can hear us. If you're able to join, we'll work with our tech team here to make sure that that's the case. But I think it just, the fact that we would have speakers coming in from Ottawa and from Kiev as well, from the Canadian government, highlights the importance of this issue for Canada. Andrii Borovyk is the Executive Director of Transparency International Ukraine. Hlib Vyshlinsky, who's the Executive Director, Center for Economic Strategy, are here as well. We thought that it was critical that we had the voice of Ukrainian civil society responding both to what partners are discussing or prioritizing as reforms in Ukraine, but also giving a sense of the Ukrainian civil society side what they view as priorities. We have a packed house here in Washington. I can see in Brussels as well and in Kiev. Boris, can I just turn over to you for 1 second?
Sure. Let me just join Jonathan in thanking and welcoming all of you, all the organizers and attendees in all three cities. This is actually our fourth Tri-City video conference event. The three earlier ones largely focused on various aspects of the elections, including overall election environment, polling, the electoral process, cybersecurity threats from Russia and elsewhere. And articles, by the way, on all of these events written by my colleague can be found in a number of publications, including the Ukraine Foundation's website, if anybody's interested. This video conference was for some reforms. And while much has been done since the last presidential and other elections in 2014, we all recognize there's still a lot of room for improvement, especially in the rule of law, anti-corruption. And both the just released Freedom House and Transparency International reports attest to this. Reforms need to continue, even they should not be hampered. But regardless of who's elected president, most likely in April, because it was over the second round, almost without a doubt, and whoever's elected Rada, there will be a lot of work and a lot of challenges ahead for years to come. We have an incredible, terrific lineup, representatives from Ukraine's three strongest international partners, what I consider to be Ukraine's three best friends, the US, EU, and Canada, which sometimes gets forgotten, but I think it's important to underscore that Canada has also been a very important partner and supporter of Ukraine over the decades, as well as civil society in Ukraine. The international community, especially civil society, will continue to play key roles and be important drivers for reforms in Ukraine, for efforts to integrate Ukraine into the Euro-Atlantic community of nations.
Great. Boris, thank you. And I agree with everything you said. And also, I apologize. I forgot Happy Valentine's Day to everybody. I can't think of a better way to spend Valentine's Day than talking about Ukraine, Ukrainian reforms, and doing it in multiple cities at the same time. So thank you. What I'm going to do is turn it over to Olena in Kiev and our guests in Kiev to kick this off. And then we'll go from Kiev over to Brussels as well. And I appreciate everyone's patience doing this video conference. is a challenge, but we really appreciate, again, all of our speakers for joining us and for participating. So Olena, over to you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Dear colleagues in Kiev, Washington, Brussels, and Ottawa, thank you very much for joining us today for this fourth meeting of the Transatlantic Task Force on Elections and Civil Society in Ukraine. As you know, public attention in Ukraine now is predominantly drawn to the presidential election campaign, and this in its turn creates the potential for some delays and setbacks in advancing Ukraine's reform agenda, because some of the most critical issues, some of the most critical reform benchmarks are not in the public debate as much as they should be anymore. But we in the civil society believe that elections are no excuse to not advancing reforms. And now that the first round of the presidential election is just 6 weeks away, we wanted to take this opportunity to draw the attention of Ukraine's international partners and the government of Ukraine to those reform priorities that we see as attainable and realistic even during the election year. Today, as colleagues said already, we have an outstanding panel of speakers in all four capitals. International partners still enjoy a very strong leverage of influence on Ukraine's reform process. That's why we're delighted to hear today from our honorable guests representing Canada, the United States, European Union, and we look forward to hearing their perspectives on what is really attainable for Ukraine this year. Also, to ensure a balanced discussion, we have invited two of our leading public experts promoting reforms in Ukraine, Hlib Vyshlinsky, who will share his views on Ukraine's economic agenda, and Andrii, Borovyk, who will expand on the governance reforms, especially those related to anti-corruption measures. With that, I would like to welcome once again our panel, our speakers, and our audiences in four capitals that joined us today, and to give the floor to Ambassador of Canada to Ukraine, His Excellency Roman Waschuk.
Thank you very much, Olena. Nearly 30 years ago, a former Canadian Prime Minister, Kim Campbell,
Добрий день. Майже 30 років.
Saying at the outset of an election campaign, elections are no time for a discussion of serious issues. She was much criticized at the time for having said it, and probably came to regret saying it. But it does illustrate some of the challenges in a polarized situation where everyone's positioning to have that substantive debate on just what it is that needs to be done, and within what is a sort of a super election year here in Ukraine, what realistically can be done. And then Canada, desperate not to be forgotten, has also volunteered to host the Ukraine Reform Conference, about which Jill Sinclair will be telling you a bit more further on, right in the middle, in the hummock between the presidential and the parliamentary elections, which has made us think a lot as well about what are the continuities, what are the imponderables of talking about reform in Ukraine in this year. I think as well the Ukrainian public, the Ukrainian voters, not just civil society, but also those people who pay attention to issues every 4 years or every 5 years, and not on a daily basis in the way that diplomats, activists, and pundits do, are being confronted with the choice of deciding whether reforms actually have happened in Ukraine, in which case there's something that you want to preserve and that would influence how you vote, or do you feel that the amount of reforms is entirely inadequate, and you either then go for a protest vote or vote for something entirely untested in the hopes that you'll finally get the reform you want. And so I think that the question of how much reform, what reform, is very much, even not necessarily explicitly stated in the kind of terms that we would use in this discussion, but implicitly is very much part of the decision-making that voters are going about as they watch the campaign here unfold. This is also a year for implementation. There have been very many laws passed over the last 4 or 5 years. Many of their provisions still not fully implemented, and we're, I think, happy that through a combination of advisory projects like our EDGE project, but also even more so the RSTs, thanks to the EU and EBRD and of course a range of US programs, are giving the government actually last year and this year the implementation capability, the actual humans who can implement reform measures in ministries. So there's quite a bit going on under the hood, even if major new reform measures are not being put to Parliament and are not making it into the IMOR index, which has not been at its most lively for the past year or so. But again, passing laws is not really what reforms are about. It is about making them real. And the capacity now that has been built in the ministries to make them real is bringing that closer. Overall, we are taking a not overly prescriptive approach to just what the reform priorities should be this year. There are those that must be done. In other words, what needs to be done to keep Ukraine in its IMF program, for example. And there are those that can be worked on because they are not immediately influenced by the electoral calendar, decentralization being one of them. And that's why we will be focusing on that area as well in terms of the Reform Conference. But I think realism should tell us that some of the big ticket items, private land sales, large-scale privatization, are not going to miraculously happen this summer. We can encourage the winners of the presidential election to think about them, to start putting them into their planning. But these are really more 2020 issues that will need to be addressed while this year's standby program and then planning for the follow-on program are being discussed. So a bit like possibly the most successful candidate in the current Ukrainian election campaign, getting the direction right but not going too heavy on the specifics may be an approach that allows the matrix, the electoral matrix of Ukrainian reform to be worked out, while then also ensuring that there is space and consideration for the key measures that will need to be taken.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And now I'd like to give the floor to Jill Sinclair, coming from Ottawa. Jill, can you hear us?
Thanks very much. Can you hear me? We can hear you fine.
Yes, we can.
Mm-hmm. Good, thank you. I'm not sure we're on video, but delighted to be able to join you remotely anyway. I'm going to just pile on to where Roman stopped. We are delighted to be hosting the third Ukraine Reform Conference. It will take place in Toronto on July 5th. More details to come. For those of you who have been following this track of effort, it was launched a couple of years ago by the British, followed up by the Danes last year. And as I say, Canada with Minister Freeland, delighted to host it in Canada. It will be a co-chaired event, as the previous ones have been, with our Ukrainian partners, Minister Klimkin, or whatever emerges from the presidential elections in terms of political laydowns. I'll just give you a very high-level approach to our thinking as we shape the third Ukraine Reform Conference. It's very much informed by the dynamics that Roman and you've talked about even in your opening comments, and that is this is in between elections. It's an extraordinary moment of opportunity and transition for Ukraine. And so we will be taking very much a forward-looking approach to the Ukraine Reform Conference. Roman talked about getting the direction right, and I think what we're looking at here is how do you consolidate the trajectory? How do you make the reforms, those foundational reforms that have already been achieved, irreversible, sustainable? How do you put in place the governance and the systems and the institutions that will make this withstand the political dynamics which any transition obviously incurs, wherever it happens to be. It's not just limited to Ukraine, but Canada or wherever in the world. And then how do you look at reform not necessarily through the prescriptive approach. Again, Roman and I haven't coordinated, but we obviously spend enough time together that we think very much alike, without going into the details of reform, but thinking about the broad trajectory of reform, and that is making accountability, integrity, prosperity, those broad themes, the themes for reform going forward. And how do you do it in a way that is inclusive of all of the players and actors nationally within Ukraine and internationally? So how do you do it in a way that government is kind of entrenched in the reform process? The private sector is included in it, international partners, bilaterally, and international financial institutions, civil society, most importantly, members of parliament who are going to be running for election, re-election, but also who have to provide that parliamentary oversight, governance, and all of the legislative to get things going once the new government is in place. So this is the overall approach to the Toronto Reform Conference. Inclusive, we will capture some of those key achievements of reform, things like decentralization, the law on national security that provides for things like civilian oversight of security and defense, public administration reform to be able to put in place the enduring governance to make reforms effective. And we will also be focusing on some of those higher level issues like a just and inclusive society, the rule of law, and the details of the reform agenda going forward, we hope will be discussed, but with a view to giving an incoming president and those who will be running for the parliamentary elections a bit of a sense of what the expectations are going forward and the support that will be coming from the international community in order to help Ukraine continue to realize its Euro-Atlantic vision and aspirations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Sinclair. And now I would like to give the floor to Deputy Ambassador of the United States to Ukraine, Pamela Tremont, for her outlook on the U.S. reform priorities for Ukraine and assistance priorities for Ukraine for this year.
Thank you, and happy Valentine's Day. We heart reforms for Valentine's Day. Since the Revolution of Dignity in 2014, we have noticed that polls show Ukrainians want three things: a successful end to the conflict, a prosperous economy, and a government that works for Ukrainians, respects their rights, and treats everybody equally. So those are reforms that we will continue to push. All of our reforms fit in that framework, and we'll continue to push those regardless of the outcome of the elections. Now, it is an election year, as Roman so eloquently put, but there have been a lot of reforms that have already been passed. And it's wise for us to look back on those and acknowledge the credit that is due. They've passed anti-corruption court legislation, a law on national security, a currency law, the state bank governance law, privatization reform, pension reform, healthcare reform, education reform. New justices have been appointed to the Supreme Court. Privat bank reform, automatic VAT registry and refund system has been created, business pressure relief law, and of course, decentralization. That's a lot to accomplish, and I think we have to acknowledge that. But it's also a lot to implement, and it's arguably more important to implement those things than to actually pass the laws that brought them into existence. So we'll be continuing to push those forward. Obviously, there are always stakeholders in the status quo who are trying to undermine the reforms that are on the path. So it's sometimes 2 steps forward and 1 step back. But we think that there's a lot that Ukraine can accomplish this year, even in an election year. In particular, the Ministry of Finance and National Bank should continue the significant fiscal and financial sector reforms that they have been undertaking. They need to continue implementing reforms of the state fiscal service and establish a separate customs and tax service. This is in line with the IMF agreement, so these are not only realistic, they're actually required to maintain IMF support. They need to continue energy reforms to build a transparent and competitive energy sector in Ukraine. Unbundling has to be done by January 1st, 2020. Again, these are not just economic reforms, these are national security issues. They can continue to improve corporate governance of state-owned enterprises. They should continue with transparent privatizations, which are key to maintaining Ukraine's fiscal health, even as they continue on the IMF path. They need to undertake preparations for land reform. As Roman said, they're not going to pass land reform, but the groundwork needs to be laid, so to speak. On anti-corruption more broadly, they need to create a credible anti-corruption court. Again, this is not just realistic, this is required by the IMF to maintain IMF support for the next tranche. We feel strongly that Ukraine needs to preserve existing and nascent institutions, specifically NABU and SAPO, and to strengthen them to continue along the anti-corruption path. And because only empowered, independent anti-corruption institutions can apply the law equally to all citizens, regardless of their wealth or power. This is what Ukrainians demanded on the Maidan in 2014. We acknowledge that reform of the electoral code probably is not realistic this year and probably couldn't be implemented by the CEC in time for the forthcoming elections. But there are ways to strengthen electoral justice, including increasing penalties for vote buying and also protecting the voting rights of IDPs and labor migrants. We think those are both realistic and possible in time for at least the parliamentary elections, if not sooner. And of course, we would like to see more protections for civil society because, of course, civil society is the backbone of a strong democracy. We're concerned by the attacks against civil society and the lack of seriousness with which some of these attacks are taken by law enforcement officials. So while that's not technically a reform, we think it's completely within the power of the government to improve in that area and critically important for the elections and beyond. Reforms are never easy. As I said, there's always people who are trying to undermine them. But what Ukraine has accomplished so far proves that a lot can be accomplished, and we think that even more can be done in 2019. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Tremont, and thank you for the U.S. support to Ukraine reforms. And now we're over to Peter Wagner, the head of the Ukraine Support Group in the European Commission in Brussels.
Thank you very much. I understand I have to speak as loudly as possible. Three perfect developments for me today. The first one is that, Jill, I am relieved seeing that the office ceilings in Canada aren't any nicer than they are in the European Commission. Because that's what we see on your video screen. I'm also quite happy that I think I could sign up to the list which Pamela had, to all of the issues Roman and Jill mentioned. So I save a lot of time of reading out the things which are important for us. It shows that we are the international community really extremely aligned, even without having had a prep meeting. So I can stay in generalities. And thirdly, I was quite happy this morning when I received a paper of the Center for European Reform, which brought a new image into the discussions. We do no longer have to discuss glass half full, glass half empty. Hello, Hlib, your glass is soon empty. Because it says 5 years, is it not a long time in Ukrainian politics, delete as appropriate. So that was, I think, a nice new one on the block, and it will make our life a little bit more interesting. From the EU side, thank you very much also for the opportunity to discuss that. We're relatively well prepared because on Monday we have to prepare our bosses. The Foreign Affairs Council will discuss state of play of reforms in Ukraine. We'll discuss also the crisis, but notably look at reforms as they do at least once a year. And it is something where also there's at the moment a lot in Brussels, and I also know in capitals going on 5 years after Maidan, because one has to put these things into the wider context. Not only say how do we feel today, but how do we see the situation today compared with where one started 5 years ago? But then also, of course, what is one still expecting, what we're also discussing today, and what are we as partners, in our case the EU, offering still as support. And there occasionally new things are coming up, like now the issues around the Azov Sea, where economic, social deterioration got worse. But at the end of the day, the big lines are clear. And I think they're also clear when one looks at the way we would have to describe the situation. And in addition to everything that is Russian cyber attacks and disinformation, we should not forget we'll have at the end of this year the gas transit somehow ending, something that will not stabilize discussions over the next 6 to 8 months. We have the elections, but believe me, the elections in Europe are as much of an issue of concern as the elections in Ukraine are for me. But we also have this year where, economically speaking, in addition to the elections, you have the enormous debt repayment, you have the continuously high, very high defense expenditure, you have a risk, which I think is becoming real, of losing international attention to notably the dimension of the aggression in the East. Look at the international donor support on the humanitarian side that is declining there. So I think there are some worrying trends which are determining our environment. Now, for us, as I said, if I could now read out what we had set out in writing ahead of the Association Council in our annual report, and since we prepared them well, they're even a few months later still up to date. A list very much aligned with what the colleagues said. I would group it in 3 parts, which we are particularly looking at the moment. The first one is it's very important that the IMF program and the macro-financial assistance program of the EU stay on track, because if these would derail, I think notably that the second half of the year, the fiscal economic situation in the country can become very problematic. The second one is, you referred to it for us, the importance of free, fair, transparent elections, presidential and parliamentary elections, and definitively everything that is happening with media, society, civil society around that. Thanks, Pamela, for making that point very strongly. I think there we would all subscribe to that. Is a very important point for us beyond just jargons. And thirdly, we really hope that generally reforms continue also on the economic side, and you referred to a lot of preparatory work on privatizations, etc., to have a credible continuation, even if we will not do quantum leaps this year, so that investors will continue looking with a bit of interest and a growing interest at the country. And for sure, there, the Ukraine Reform Conference, which our Canadian colleagues are organizing, will help a lot. So I think for that, in that environment, we are also very optimistic with regard to 2019. And if I try, without going into details, to explain that, you will see that in the way how we are preparing at the moment the budgetary support, the technical assistance and everything that we have in the pipeline. We have the first big block on our side, which is the continuation of a number of key reforms, where the continuation also of the support programs is necessary, anti-corruption and decentralization on our side. We believe there will be a continuation of a reform drive. Therefore, we make sure that the support in these 2 crucial areas is also available beyond the end also of 2019. Another important one, which always sounds so technical, but it's the whole support to the association agreement and DCFTA implementation. We know that this is tedious, that this is sometimes painful if you talk about certain issues also in RADA, because you really touch upon vested interests, and they are strong and getting stronger maybe. But here as well, we are convinced that this is, trade figures are confirming that, the way to go and to continue to go. Thirdly, thank you, Roman. You mentioned the reform support teams, which are for us part of the wider also public administration reform, where many actors are in. We are in with what we call the reform architecture, so we have a whole other, with budget support, we have other elements of support for this kind of governance reform. And there as well, we will continue making the necessary means available in an adaptable way to see where the next reform opportunities are coming up. And then definitely also 2019 for us with regard to support that we are making available, civil society, where we're trying into new ways to go deeper and wider into the country. Some of you know that as an EU, we have a bit of a tendency to maybe be too much capital and center based, and we really try to find new ways to go further out there. And then we keep a certain bit of margin to see how things develop this year, which is the reform appetite that is becoming visible, because sometimes there are the surprises. We're expecting surprises somewhere or positive developments throughout the year, in addition to definitively also less positive ones. And with that, as I said, I come back to our three main blocks mentioned at the beginning. If the IMF program, macro-financial, stays on track, if the elections can be held in a free, transparent way, and if there is a bit of a credible continuation of this economic liberalization agenda, etc., I think the rest should work out if we're all sufficiently flexible.
Well, Peter, thank you very much for giving us a clear picture. It's not all gloom. I heard you expressing optimism that we also have to keep real about some of the challenges. And perhaps we'll not always be able to shape a solution the way we want, given the political realities. It remains to be seen. But I do understand from your contribution that the EU will remain vested in Ukraine, our geographic neighbor, after all, and help the transition in that country. So without much further ado, let's go back to Kiev for comments from Hlib and Andrii.
Thank you, Bruno. Thank you, Mr. Wagner. It's good to hear that our international partners are reasonably enthusiastic about reform prospects for Ukraine, and that the key reform priorities will continue receiving the support of the international community. And now we would like to hear the reflections of our experts, of Hlib, Vyshlinsky, and Andrii Borovyk, on whether these reform priorities that our international partners outlined coincide or go align with the reform priorities of the Ukrainian civil society. Hlib, I would like to first of all give the floor to you for your thoughts, first of all, on what was said, and secondly, on what the economic agenda for Ukraine should be this year.
Yeah, thank you. I will differentiate here between economic agenda and reforms, because they are slightly different fields now, I could say. And this week there was a very large investment conference organized by Dragon Capital. Colleagues from the company told me that there was a record high participation, but unfortunately, in their opinion, not because Ukraine became so attractive for investment, but because risks are so high and the situation is so unpredictable that everybody who has some portfolio investment to Ukraine came to understand what will happen in Ukraine and our country. And this is mainly the issue of economic agenda, not the issue of reforms to large extent. And what colleagues, what Roman told, what colleagues from the European Union and from the United States said in their contributions, they are mostly about, I could say, hygienic minimum for this year. That is what those investors coming to Kiev wanted to hear about. Generally, if to summarize it, will IMF program be in place during all this year? Will we receive the second tranche? And will, after the president will be elected, the conditionality of the program be respected? And so generally, will Ukraine have the macroeconomic stability, and whether it will be able to respect its responsibilities or to repay sovereign debt that we have to do this year in the volume of over $6 billion and more or less the same amount in the next 2 years each. So and here there are mainly 3 key issues, and on those issues candidates, presidential candidates and parties they are affiliated with have very different different opinions. And the first is certainly gas prices, and this is the key conditionality for the next IMF program review. Gas prices should be increased for population on additional 15%. Like technically it was already done by Cabinet of Ministers decision, but like any Cabinet's decision could be revised by the Cabinet by the time when it will come into force, in this case, 1st of May. The second is certainly responsible fiscal policy and respecting the maximum budget deficit that is set in the budget, and certainly NBU independence. Independence of the central bank is very important to maintain current monetary policy that is considered by both IMF and investors prudent and good for economy. But this is economic agenda. This is not reforms. This is just like behaving in a responsible way to preserve this financial stability in the country. But when we speak about reforms, like I could name 5 reforms that are the most important in the economic policy this year, and I will disagree with colleagues, with our international partners on the land reform, not because it is not important, on the opposite way. We believe that it is so important that it should be priority even this year, because this month there was a presentation of a very interesting World Bank study on the economic growth potential of Ukraine, and we see that there is that Ukraine has very limited potential to grow because of demographic problems. We have diminishing human capital. Because of lack of investment, we have depreciation physical capital, and generally like the only low-hanging fruit we could have to get higher economic growth rates that will satisfy the Ukrainian population need for better well-being is in fact opening land market and injection investment into the agriculture. So which is the only like big low-hanging fruit. And also like I could say that currently the situation with opening land market is not only a policy issue, but it is to a higher extent legal issue, because after the decision of the European Court of Human Rights, there are different processes that started in the judicial system to undermine this land sales moratorium based on the decision of the European Court of Human Rights. The second priority, as was mentioned, which was privatization of all large-scale state-owned enterprises that are allowed for sale, and significantly shorten the list of SOEs prohibited for privatization in line with triage results. And certainly, yes, shortening this list of prohibited enterprises is a job for the next parliament. Realistically, it could be done next year. The third reform is simplifying and streamlining customs procedures and introducing the Institute of Authorized Economic Operators, which is a very important part of our cooperation and like what we do together with the European Union, because it is really very important for Ukrainian companies to become more competitive in the global value chains, and especially important to have the full use of free trade agreement with the European Union, becomes the part of value chains that could have both EU companies and European companies. The fourth is the part of the IMF program, and this is relaunching of the state fiscal service and establishing the financial investigation services that will replace tax police and numerous economic crime units at law enforcement agencies. And the most important precondition to have this reform successful is that employees of all these new services should be vetted, and in fact it should be relaunched, not just like reformed as many unsuccessful cases that we saw in other law enforcement agencies. And the final one is further liberalization of capital controls and foreign exchange regulations. The new law, as everybody knows, was passed, new law on foreign exchange operations was passed last year. It gave freedom to the National Bank to regulate them, and we already saw some liberalization at the beginning of this year. However, we need more to become to make Ukrainian companies more competitive, more attractive for foreign investment, and we need also to adapt to, in fact, to do what we need to do, what we should do in line with association agreement with the European Union, and open Ukraine to the capital flows from the European Union in to full extent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hlib. Now I'd like to turn it over to Andrii. Andrii, governance reforms are, of course, among the most important ones, the most critical ones Ukraine is working on. Could you please share your views and the views of Transparency International on which of the reform benchmarks in the anti-corruption field and other governance-related fields are attainable this year? And please reflect on what the international partners said before, please.
Thank you, Olena. I will start a bit from the past. A couple of weeks ago, Transparency International presented our yearly corruption perception index. This year, Ukraine gained another 2 points. So now we have 32 points, but only out of 100 maximum. So in total, after 5 years, after the Revolution of Dignity, we gained 7 points. Someone probably will say this is not much. I would share this opinion because we have much more expectations back in 2014. But when you start working, when you start doing the reforms, I mean, in general, you see that it's not as easy, and it can't be done just in 1 year or like this. So I look more positive that we still, these 5 years, we were moving in the right direction. Yes, quite often, as it was said, we had like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, or just staying at the same position. But still, we have lots of achievements. I'll just name a few of them, like public procurement system, electronic declarations, lots of new anti-corruption institutions. And the most recent one, which would not be achievable without the support of international community, and specifically without G7 involvement, EU and IMF and all these international agreements where the High Anti-Corruption Court was included, which is supposed to become the last part of the anti-corruption chain which was formed. And we really thankful for that, and we hope that this election year in Ukraine we finally will have this court. And but again, we will not have the results just immediately, because the cases on corruption, especially on high-level corruption, which investigated by NABU and SAPO, they're really complicated. It takes like time to even to gather the evidences, and then for the judge to look at those evidences. So most probably we can evaluate this experience only next year. But what I can say today that the experience when the international experts included in the process of selection of the judges are extremely positive. This is probably the best example, the example which can be told everywhere, that these experts, they did really good job. Most of those corrupted seem to be corrupted guys, or with the guys to whom they had lots of questions, they just didn't pass through these PCIe interviews. But of course, we also understand that this year is heavily political because of the 2 election campaigns. In TI, we don't think that it is possible this year to start some new reforms, I mean, from the scratch. But as Ambassador Waschuk said, that lots of laws was voted last 2 years. So things like decentralization, health reform, even some part of the reform of privatization, because now the small privatization is going on, it will continue definitely. But whether there is a possibility to start something new, I don't think so. But what we can do this year is to preserve what we have for today. If talking about the anti-corruption infrastructures like NABU, SAPO, of course we need some, we already need some changes, because some agencies like Agency on Prevention of Corruption, showing their work really politically engaged, so they're not doing what they were supposed to do. We have issues with SAPO, specifically with their management, because I could not forget what happened a year ago in spring with this fish tank case. I would say that it's some problems with integrity in SAPO's management. But again, we have more and more cases investigated by NABU. They pass in more and more cases to the court, and I hope when the court will be established, they will just step in and start working on those cases. So we need to preserve what we have for today, and we need to continue working on that things which we started last year. Because we also, I think that at the national level, this is like our limit what we can do. But if we will talk about the local level, I mean the level of the cities and the regions, there is an opportunity to start new stuff, because this is the last year before the election year, which will be held next in 2020. So there is lots of possibilities to work with the local authorities in order to increase transparency and accountability. This is what actually we do, and we will concentrate on. But of course, we working on general reform agenda, specifically on the corruption agenda, which I hope will be also included at the Ukraine Reforms Conference in Toronto. At that point of time, we will have the new president. So it would be like a good opportunity for the foreign governments and for the new president and local authorities to hear kind of what should be done. But again, I understand that lots of things depends not only from the president, but from the parliament as well. It's very hard now to predict what will happen. So I'm usually myself, I'm never look at those polls which show who will be the majority in the next parliament, because now it's heavily influenced because of the presidential elections. But in general, we are ready for the more active reforms after the election. All the election campaigns will pass. So, and we stay positive what will happen. And of course, we have some level of uncertainty because you're getting the information from different sources. But my personal view is that I'm not really taking seriously those polls which come in now. It's better to look at them in March, being closer to the date of the elections, because every 2 weeks we have some new data and trying to predict what will going on. I think we need to wait a couple of weeks more when people become more stable with their decision who may win. But who will win, we need to demand reforms and changes which actually started back in 2014. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrii. Sounds like Ukraine does have a long to-do list this year. Even if new reforms and reform initiatives are not launched, there are a lot of them waiting for implementation since previous years. So that's what we can do realistically before, between, and after the elections. And now we're back to Washington, D.C. to hear some questions from the audience there. Jonathan?
Olena, thank you. And thank you to all of our speakers, too. I think it's you touched on so many different aspects of both reforms, the elections, both from the perspective of Brussels, but also Ottawa, Washington, civil society, community. I know I have a lot of questions for all of you, but I first want to just turn to our audience here first to see the participants who are here in Washington, to see if they have any questions. And maybe I'll just sort of warm up too with my just one initial question, which is on the IMF and macroeconomic support. I think I heard directly from Peter how important it is this year to make certain that Ukraine deals with this macro economic issue. I was there back working on the U.S. Loan guarantees, so I know that even the timeline on these issues impacts the U.S. as well, and sort of U.S. thinking. But I wanted to hear maybe from your perspectives too. Do you share Peter's concerns and thoughts on staying on course, and what does that mean in the middle of? I guess you can't really answer the question, what does it mean? But how does Ukraine do that in the middle of an election? And how important? What is the messaging coming from you, and then also from civil society on this question as well? Because I think it touches on fault lines, political fault lines as well. And I just wanted to get your thoughts, because I think that's an issue. I know it's not, it is front and center even in the presidential elections. You see it with some of the candidates, but it's something that has to be incorporated and thought about throughout this year. And the importance, I suspect, of the international community and international partners is particularly important over the next year to get this right so that there isn't a potential financial crisis, but maybe the civil society side maybe doesn't see this crisis in the same manner that maybe foreign partners, IMF, the EU, and others are thinking. So if I could just ask that question of you, I know it's a little bit long-winded, but I think it sort of looms, and it's really important to address.
Is that a question to Peter?
That's to the ambassador, to Pam as well, and then also civil society colleagues too, including Hlib too, to talk about that and how civil society is viewing this, because these are issues not including the issues of land reform, but some of these other issues that really touches on the livelihoods and the lives of Ukrainians. And I can, as somebody who's worked politically as well, I know how tough it is for candidates and political parties not to grab on to politically popular positions versus doing what needs to be done by governments. So for the ambassador, but also Pam too, just those issues and how that's factoring into your thinking going into this year.
I think certainly Prime Minister Groysman and his cabinet are pretty focused on ensuring that they stay within the program. They, I think, are doing everything on the regulatory side that does not require RADA approval to stay within. I think there is on the, what's also happening this year is that we do not have a terribly favorable emerging markets environment for raising money for a country like Ukraine, which at one level has macro indicators that aren't too bad, has had performance issues in the past, and and where perceptions are shaped not only by views of Ukraine, but views of Argentina, views of Turkey, views of all sorts of other emerging markets. So that means on the part of partners also not falling into a sense of complacency that the IMF program alone will be a magic wand that takes care of Ukraine's every macroeconomic worry. We are at a time when a range of concessional macroeconomic instruments are reaching their best before date and either need to be replaced by commercial lending or some coalition of the willing. I think the World Bank is thinking about this as well, that could help, I wouldn't say replace everything from 14-15, but at least cushion a transition while Ukraine goes through 2019.
Thank you. Pamela?
Yes, certainly. It is a key it is a key issue for this year. However, I believe that the risk of the risk related to macroeconomic stability this year, I mean really this year is really low because of two factors. Like the first factor is that without IMF program there will be a big trouble for any political player who could undermine it, and on another side, conditionality is not so complicated. Like, in fact, it is just this issue with gas prices, with anti-corruption court, the probability that everything will be fine with hiring new judges and pushing it into operation is also rather high. Like, the only decision that should be made by parliament is split law, and even if it is not passed, it is not certainly not number one priority in Ukrainian reform agenda, but also probability that it will pass. It will be passed is not that low. I believe that it could be passed. So the bigger question is like what will come in next years. On one side, like we have this very high continuation of this very high external debt repayments in next 2 years, and every possible government, like each possible government, should address it in some way, and the president should address it in some way. And if we look on the roster of the most realistic candidates and their political forces, like we are certainly clear that current President Petro Poroshenko will continue to somehow defend macroeconomic stability, and even doing it in the last moment as it was done last year, but still it is a priority. For Yulia Tymoshenko, like her numerous policy initiatives are against not only the wording but also the spirit of the IMF program, and it is a risk. However, like we understand that she also knows that with such a big external debt repayments, the risk of bringing country to default and political risk to her of bringing country to default, to sovereign default, could be tragic for her political career. So she was a prime minister. She has some history of dealing with IMF, and generally we could more or less predict how it could be. Like not the best scenario, but I do not believe that it should be tragic for her and for the country as well. However, with the third candidate, Volodymyr Zelensky, nobody could predict like what will be his opinion. However, in this case, like we understand that, and in all other two cases, we understand that the parliament will be very fragmented. On one side, it is bad because it will be very hard to build a coalition. It will be very hard to appoint a prime minister. On another side, it means that risks of consolidation power around president and parliamentary majority is also not so realistic. And generally, like we believe that the next president will be will have less political capital than, for example, Petro Poroshenko had 5 years ago, just because there will be he or she will be the president of minority. So I believe that generally risks are high, but the probability of these risks materializing are not as high as it could be. Thank you.
I think it was Mr. Juncker who once said in the midst of the Euro crisis that we all know what needs to be done, we just don't know how to get reelected if we do it. And I don't think that says anything about the prospects for politicians being reelected here, but it does demonstrate that these sort of tough economic decisions are always difficult for politicians. And but the Ukrainian government has shown over and over that it's able to do the reforms necessary even when it could affect them personally in forthcoming elections. So we're watching the financial situation, we're watching market receptivity to Ukrainian debt, as Roman described. We're watching the ability of the government to fulfill its IMF conditionalities, and we're watching what the candidates are saying, but we feel confident that people are realistic about what needs to be done, and the risks of default would govern their decision-making in the long run.
Thank you, Pamela. Do we have other questions from Washington?
We do, and but I also wanted to see, Peter, was anything that you wanted to weigh in, since I picked on you for this question?
Yes. Now, as I said earlier on, I'm very optimistic, I'm very positive, but on the macro side and fiscal side, I'm a bit more pessimistic than what you just said. There are also other, the Juncker quote in this respect is a good one, yes. it definitely touches upon the issues, because if the programs are supposed to be on track, and even if we don't go into details, we have very problematic, at least decisions to be kept on track when it comes to energy prices, etc., the unbundling of markets, but also some more steps when it comes to the fight against corruption. Both are from vested interest and from the side of any potential populistic movement extremely risky areas. And therefore, it's good to hear that in Kiev, and you're closer to it, you're optimistic, but this is where really we think things can go off track. And in that respect, it is partly the numbers, but Roman made that point very well. The emerging markets are down 25% or so, and it's not only the money that comes in, it's the trust that the markets have, because the international partners can always, in addition to some money, notably inject trust and stability into the system. And therefore, any of the two programs getting off track by not delivering, and there are conditions there, is problematic. And that's also, Roman, while indeed we are all together following it very closely, a coalition of the willing, but even there, to it, and there's one. Okay, but he also said there are situations during the financial crisis where you have to lie, but the fact is you cannot cheat the markets long term. So even if there is a coalition of willing trying to do something, if the programs and the markets go off track, it will become quite problematic. And that's why on this one, I'm optimistic and think this can be done, but it will require quite a bit of stability. On the other hand, let me add some other positive element and confirm that I see it a bit like Andrii. It's notably at the local and regional level where the situation has changed so much in big parts of the country, where now also some new steps and new developments are possible, while maybe we have to be a bit more modest at this moment at the central level. I hope that was sufficient as an answer to your question, Jonathan.
No, thank you. And it sounds to me like we expect there'll be some different perspectives, but it sounds like everybody's on top of this issue, both in terms of working with the Ukrainians, and hopefully, Jill, in that the conference in the summer, I'm certain that will be a focal point, since you'll be almost in between the parliamentary and the presidential elections, how important it will be to keep a focus on this issue. If I can, there's a couple of other questions we have here. If you could just bear with us when we start at the end. And please identify yourself and who you're with. And hold on one second. Yes, we have a microphone coming to you.
My name is Yaroslav Martinyuk. I'm formerly with Radio Liberty. A lot has been mentioned about EU support for Ukraine. And it's been also noted that the fiscal situation can deteriorate and reach a crisis situation and risk further destabilization of reforms. Today, Ukraine is earning approximately $3 to $4 billion from gas transit fees via its pipelines. When Nord Stream 2 is completed, what is the likelihood that Ukraine will lose? There's a likelihood that Ukraine will lose this revenue and further aggravate the fiscal situation. My question is twofold. What is EU's position on Nord Stream 2? And two, what can be done by the EU to stop completion of this pipeline?
Thank you for that question. We're gonna bundle a few. We're gonna bundle instead of unbundle. But Ambassador, question here, and we have a Nord Stream 2 question. I expected that to come up with all of our participants.
Thank you, Temuri Yakubashvili. This is the right strategist. The tragedy of the situation that every single speaker that was speaking is right, but the problem is that it's not working. And it's not working because we are trying to renovate apartments in the failing buildings. And obviously we are all proud of reforms here and there. We are so proud of renovated apartments in 7th floors and in the 5th floor, but the building is failing. I understand that it's not the job of the international community to save the building. Probably it's a job of the Ukrainian people itself. But, whole approach that to renovate apartment can only be self-congratulatory approach that will be proud of having this reform there that will last 2 or 3 years, or that reform in other place. Now, it seems to me that economic data indicates that Ukraine is not doing well. So whatever we are calling reform is not working. An approach should be, in my humble or not very humble opinion, different. For example, if we are talking about anti-corruption measures, it's laughable. Are we really going to solve the problem of corruption by having the anti-corruption courts and anti-corruption bureaus that will easily become the political instrument in somebody's hands? Or we are going to take the structural reforms that will eliminate base for corruption. I don't see it happening in Ukraine, and I believe that it should be job of the Ukrainian NGO sector, which is enormously capable in this regard, to push their own government. And, I don't see a tragedy in 2014. Why we think that it's the end of the world? What's wrong if Ukraine will default and then we'll start from the zero? That's my question to economic experts.
Well, let me do this because I want to. Those I think raised really great questions. We're going to turn to Brussels next for questions. But there was a couple questions here in this. First one about Nord Stream 2 and obviously the impact of that on Ukraine, but also the position of Brussels on that issue. But also I certainly welcome the weigh-in of others on that issue. But then also this issue of reforms and whether reforms undertaken are doing what they should do, whether or not the anti-corruption reforms aren't really getting at the heart of the problem. And of course, in self-reflection, 5 years in, I think that even partners of Ukraine, but also civil society can maybe take some stock taking of what's worked and what hasn't worked. Of course, for many of you who don't know, Tamori, who just spoke, was a former ambassador here from Georgia. So I think he knows quite a bit about the reform process that took place in Georgia, what didn't work as well, and always adds, I think, an important perspective that we need to self-reflect and adjust to what has worked, what has not worked. So I'm going to send it back to first, maybe Peter, to you on Nord Stream 2, but also other, if the ambassador, if you as well want to weigh in on, which is a difficult issue to square. Obviously, energy security for Ukraine, economic security for Ukraine is paramount, something that we've all worked towards for those partners of Ukraine to see them succeed. Maybe you can weigh in on that issue. Thank you.
Not sure I got the end of it, but let's say on Nord Stream, I think that now the EU or Brussels is quite a multi-layer structure, and if you look at the Commission, it has made it very clear with regard to Nord Stream how it sees that the project should have been handled legally, and I think there have now been some developments also in the Council. We'll have to see what they will mean in the end with regard to the possible impact on Nord Stream and Ukraine, but all of this is at the moment still a bit speculation. Now, what is clear is that indeed there are numerous developments for economic, political and other reasons why people have certain approaches to it. Some of our member states, as it's an open secret, have see it differently than some of the institutions, etc. But I think that's all we are. And at the moment, there is a very clear line from the Commission. We want, as by the way, also member states, to continue that Ukraine continues being a transition country. We are very actively involved in the trilateral gas talks. Vice President Shevchovich is regularly pulling together the sides and trying to see what this future could look like. So I think on our side, this is as clear as in the European EU context you can usually expect things to be. What is of course also not simplifying discussions that has to be mentioned is that the whole reform debate has not been very conducive so far to make the point on the international participation in the Ukrainian system, etc., how to move forward. So I think on that, we are indeed, I think reforms in the energy sector are at the moment the ones which we regularly say are the ones which are probably the most fragile ones, where we see a lot of pressure and where you just have to look at the different statements, regularly continue to push that they have to go ahead because it's a wider package that has to be looked at here in the energy area, a wider field. And one has to really also see there the necessary developments on the regulator, on the management, on the way state-owned companies are managed, on the independence of their boards. So I think it's a huge field which goes beyond only one specific pipeline here.
Over to you, Jonathan.
I just want to see if if there is weigh-in from Kiev on this, because I know it's a challenging subject.
Yeah, we do. Ambassador would like
Sure.
to comment.
We are not advocating default for Ukraine as an easy ticket out. Sort of like pull down the whole building and start rebuilding it. That, unfortunately, Ukraine in its current situation, including its geopolitical challenge, its de facto war with Russia, can't simply have the luxury of tearing itself down and rebuilding from scratch. So there is a degree of redoing apartments one by one, while hoping that you also get the condominium corporation or the OSBB, as it would be considered here, to agree on doing things that prevent the building from falling down from decrepitude while you're doing it. The anti-corruption court and how useful it will be, there is no single silver bullet that will solve Ukraine's issues, but possibly the most corrosive thing in Ukrainian public life is the culture of impunity. I would say actually that measures, including those in the energy sector and others, the introduction of Prozoro, et cetera, have probably reduced, and I think this is an Ivan Miklos statistic, the space for corruption by about 60%. But most people don't care. Ukrainians don't care, and evidently you there in Washington don't care very much either, because bad people have not been punished. And that's where the court becomes important. I think there is more money in the Ukrainian budget. There is more being done on health. There are more roads being rebuilt. As long as people feel that it's all unfair, they aren't really taking that on board. And that's why I think you've seen in the public opinion polls, Ukraine has reverted to type. So if you look over the last decade or decade and a half, the normal state of affairs is 68 to 75% believe the country's going in the wrong direction, and then somewhere between 8 and 15, 16, 17% believe it's going in the right direction unless there's been a revolution, then temporarily it bumps up. One goes down to about 45, the other one bumps up to about 35, and then it reverts. So we've reverted to the norm. There is also, I think, because of the large shadow economy, although according to the government it's shrinking, possibly, actually more going on here than the official statistics suggest. Certainly, it is difficult to reconcile what was mentioned at the Dragon Capital Conference, for example, on Monday, that most companies in the stable of foreign investors, those are here, are growing at a rate of about 20% a year in terms of sales, while official GDP is growing at 3.4, 3.5%. Something's not quite right here, and it's probably not quite right on the upside as opposed to the downside. I think, again, we've been talking a lot about the macro framework today, but in terms of retail sales, up 6.1% in Ukraine last year, real wages up 10%, also because of the wage pressure from out-migration to the EU, largely temporary, but still with a danger of draining the national labor pool. Ukrainians actually generally think, I think, the economic situation is worse than it actually is. They tend to underestimate their income because they calculate at direct undervalued hryvnia to dollar as opposed to purchasing power parity. In fact, if you look at the IMF stats, purchasing power parity GDP is now at its highest point since the mid-90s. But no Ukrainian voter believes that. So, lies, damn lies, statistics, yes, but people can also persuade themselves, and thanks to their politicians and media, act on the basis of believing that things are happening that are not actually in their best interests.
Thank you, Ambassador. We're back to Andrii. Excuse me, Andrii.
I was just going to say I completely agree with the ambassador, but particularly with regard to the corruption reforms, there's no silver bullet. If someone has one, they should let us know. But obviously, corruption is something that has to be dismantled piece by piece, and we have to start to build that culture of intolerance for corruption. We can't do that overnight. But as we close that space for corruption and we start to make people understand they don't have to tolerate it, people will become part of the solution.
Once President Poroshenko said that change is happening fast or never, but I would definitely agree that change is never happening overnight. There's definitely no silver bullet for solving the issue of corruption. If would probably agree, so maybe we'll have some country who has in corruption perception index 100 out of 100 points, but it will never happen because corruption exists always in every country, just in different measure of it. But what I want to say about the Anti-Corruption Code and NABU, those institutions aimed on top-level corruption, and the point is to really ending the impunity of those guys who staying in power for so many years, for decades. And of course, it's not a solution because court and detectives and investigators, it's about punishment. But the real key for solving the issue with the corruption is the prevention. And in Ukraine, we made lots of changes and reforms regarding the prevention. Would the new public procurement system isn't the prevention of corruption when everybody sees everything? Yes, there is still some problems, there is violation of law, but much less than it was before. Whether open like dozens of registries which are now open and for free to the citizens, wasn't a part of corruption? It was. Is a healthcare reform, like the first level of healthcare reform, when just ordinary doctors started receiving normal salaries, and you as a patient shouldn't give them like I don't know, like $10, $15 for their work. It's also elimination of corruption, and of course prevention and transparency. This is the first steps for eliminating the corruption. But only doing one thing like or prevention, or engaging more people, or just punishment will never work. This is why we are moving in like every direction. Somewhere like with a better pace, somewhere unfortunately slower, like with the prevention, what I said about National Agency on Prevention of Corruption. So we have as good examples and as bad examples, but we're trying to do as much as we could. And I would not say that Ukraine now it's building which will fall down, because I think for the last 5 years we did enough for this building not to fall down, definitely.
And the small comment from me, I fully agree with the IMF that building the full anti-corruption vertical and establishing anti-corruption court is the key, because like you mentioned structural reforms as something that could undermine corruption opportunities. Yes, to some extent. However, firstly, like we see that unpunished people, and I fully agree with Ambassador on impunity as the key problem in Ukraine. These unpunished people, they just devise new schemes. Like you have the same surnames, Mykola Martynenko, Anton Yatsenko, and other people who are being not punished, like their previous scheme was killed. Now they start devising new scheme and pushing it through the parliament, and they are successful in it. The first. And the second is that For business, the key impediment to investment is lack of trust to judiciary, and you could not heal judiciary system from corruption without punishment. Like you could not do any structural reforms that will prevent corrupt decision by judges that allow for raidership and racketeering by state officials. Thank you.
Thank you, Hlib. We're back to Washington now.
Great. I think what we're going to do right now, Bruno, is to turn it over to you to see if there's questions in Brussels and from your participants there. Bruno, turning it over to you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Well, actually, I have a question of my own. So we talked about trust, building trust in the midst of a lot of unpredictability. That unpredictability could become real uncertainty, and that uncertainty could perhaps even materialize in scenarios that we described: infiltration of populism, the relationship with the IMF going off track, just to name a few. So the question I have, I mean, since we are among friends of Ukraine here, how do we continue to make the argument in our European and North American capitals that it's worth investing in Ukraine, despite the bumpy road? I think all of us would definitely feel it's useful for our work. So even though things are not going perhaps always the way we want it, what are the arguments that we must make to make sure that international donors, governments in Europe and America support Ukraine? I think for now that's it from Brussels.
Who wants to tackle that one first in Kiev? Or Peter, if you want to tackle that.
I'll leave this one for you now, for Kiev.
I mean, I think it's a very good question. It's the same question previous Secretary of State had about why, particularly in the United States, why should we care about Ukraine? Why should the U.S. invest as much as it's invest, and should that investment continue? So I think it's a great question, one that I think is constantly being asked here in Washington.
I'll take a stab at it. Because Ukraine is systemically important to the Euro-Atlantic space, the integrity of territorial integrity, not changing boundaries by force, etc. I think when it comes to the European space, and Peter may have more to offer on this, I think one of the sort of sleeper developments of the last couple of years, and it's being talked about more and more now, is the fact is that Ukraine is now integrated into the Central and East European labor pool. It's not simply another place. It is a place that on which the prosperity of Poland and a number of other neighboring countries now depends. With the development of an auto supply value chain, etc., other parts of European industry are becoming codependent in certain respects on Ukraine. So I think there are quiet developments that actually make Ukraine more relevant and more connected to us. I mean, the redirection of the flow of people, both into and out of Ukraine, which now flows east-west as opposed to north-south, or Ukraine to Siberia. It's now Ukraine to everything from Poland to Portugal. Is also a significant dimension. I think it is a bit disingenuous to expect at the same time, Singaporean reform tempos and achievements with a kind of basis démocratie, almost Swiss referendum approach to democracy or something like that. We have very high expectations on the inclusion, democratization, no voice goes unheard approach, and yet we want absolute laser-like focus on imposing austerity, running primary budget surpluses, telling pensioners to stuff it, get used to it. These are not things that can all happen at the same time. So yes, the road is bumpy because we are expecting a democratic transition. the road is bumpy because we respect private property rights. In other words, you can't simply go and take all the wealth away from oligarchs. You can't de-oligarchize through a sort of blue and yellow terror that would take it all away and redistribute. And also because these people are all registered in their companies in Western stock exchanges and bank accounts and whatever. So I think where we have a problem is that we collectively bought into a maximalist vision of what post-Maidan change in 2014-15 would do, and we're now discovering that it's much more complicated in ways that are partly unique to Ukraine, but partly simply the way democratic governance and vested interests, not in the evil sense of vested interests, but normal vested interests, regional, economic, and others in a country work out. But Ukraine is an important part of the Euro-Atlantic system, and that is why it deserves continuing support and attention.
Thank you. Andrii?
5 years ago, after the Revolution of Dignity, there were for myself, two results. The first one, that the most corrupted president ever ran to Russia, and another one, that what happened with the society. Society showed that they really care about the state, what always was questionable in this country, and then it formed in kind of civil society and strong civil society organizations. Maybe I'm wrong, but in my opinion, that the result of the reforms which started in 2014 and 2015 were generated within the civil society, and of course with the help of international partners. And this was the first push of the reforms which actually happening even now. But with the most recent experience, I will go back again to the High Anti-Corruption Court. I'll just remind that the idea of High Anti-Corruption Court happened 3 years ago, and it took more than 2 years to be voted in the parliament, but without the pushing from the civic society organizations and without help of international organizations and this principle of sandwich when the politicians were in between of it, it would never happen. If I'll just give you another example, that from the very beginning, President Poroshenko was saying that we don't need High Anti-Corruption Court. He was saying that this court is established only underdeveloped countries, that we need only chambers in current courts. But we didn't agree with that, and in cooperation with the EU and US, Canada partners, we finally, on the final line of this achievement. And another point is that we've done so many different changes within the state authorities. Again, remembering about the open registries, ProZorro, that we now able even to export changes. A small example, the ProZorro, which was developed here in this country, already exported to Moldova, and it's working in Moldova now. So when you have such a problem, I say, underdeveloped state, you may produce much better ideas, which will be much better than in the Western world, and you can share and export it because you see that you got nothing and you need to create the best of the best. And I think these two parts are the main reasons why Ukraine should be supported. I will not go to the geopolicy and talking about the Russia and in between the Europe, no, just these two reasons. Because we can, with international support, we can do changes. And for sure, the next president will be much weaker than the current one. Because for the last 5 years, civic society got so much experience and was tricked so many times that for the next president, we will never this buy-in again.
Thank you, Andrii. Back to Washington now.
Great, thank you.
Jonathan, I have one more comment here from Brussels.
Great.
Peter would like to jump in one more time. Took me a moment. Your question is too complex for someone who is mainly there to somehow, on the rowing decks, try to provide the necessary support to all these big things which are happening in this enormous country. So it took me a moment with your complex question. But let me start with a counter question. Why not? What has changed between 2014 and today? Why we should change our approach? That's the basic answer, if I understood the main thread of your question well. I also avoid going into any kind of geopolitical, whatever you have there, dimensions. There's enough ambassadors and diplomats around for that. But I would like to go into what the EU normally does. We are a very bureaucratic, process-driven, obsessed with institutions and compromises organism, which in the Commission has its kind of specific institution bringing all of that with its good and negative elements together. But we have 5 years ago signed up to a long-term commitment. We have an association agreement, we have a DCFTA, and it is not a coincidence that this is the kind of furthest going, is that the right English word, agreement that we have with any other country, that nothing in this respect has changed. We do not see either here that the people who've been driving these changes, and you refer to them, it's not only civil society, in my view, as a part of it. If you look at all the surveys I look at, and if you look at the underlying value issues, etc., nothing has changed. There is a stable relation, there are stable expectations with regard to us. So I really don't see why it's happening. On the economic integration, great to see here that you're seeing it already so far advanced, Raman. That is probably true, but there is even much more potential into it. If you look at under how difficult circumstances and with maybe not always 100% of efforts, one has already achieved so much with regard to trade improvements and developments. If you look at that potential and all the elements mentioned in the first round of the discussions, it's enormous on both. So I think, and this now allows me really to have now a good Juncker phrase. Pamela, you really put me there in a difficult situation with this good one earlier on. But as Juncker said, as long as the Ukrainian people and government want to continue on this reform path, we are with them. And until then, we don't see what has changed.
Okay. Well, Peter, thank you very much. I think declarations of commitments are appropriate on February 14th. Over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you. And I also just, if we could, there's a couple of comments here. I know we're getting close in the time, but before I also do that too, Olena, is there anybody in Kiev, your participants who are watching this and participating from that perspective, they have questions for our speakers?
Yes, do we have questions from Kiev?
Go.
Seems like we don't. We do. We actually do have to. Please identify yourself and ask your question.
Vladimir Martanyuk, member of the board of International Foundation of Economic Reforms in Ukraine. Until 2014, I was a director of this foundation, and we coordinated legislation with EU requirements. And I would like to draw the attention to such an important topic, because not many people see this, and some people keep silence about this and do not know what to do with it. Unfortunately, in Ukraine and in other post-Soviet states, except the Baltic states, we do not have proper market. We have feudalism, actually, neo-feudalism, and I speak about it since 1990s, and some people support me, Mr. Atkin from Cambridge and other people, other scientists, and they say yes, the society is not going to the direction of capitalism, but into the direction of neo-feudalism. So I would like to say that this is the main problem that prevents us from moving in the right direction and to solve our tasks properly. So corruption for feudalism is a normal state, and corruption is not bad than feudalism, and feudalism uses different rules for judging rich people and poor people. And I do not want to go into theoretical details, but I would like to say that Ukraine does not have proper capitalism, proper system, and three things prevent us from reaching capitalism. This is lack of the market, and the second is the absence of land market and stock market. And there is no proper infrastructure for land market, because in the USA, in Canada, in Europe, it has its specific infrastructure, and you know about it, and we do not have proper infrastructure. And they say here that we should launch this land market, and those deputies, they try to cancel some laws that I helped to launch about land, about other important things. And what is the question? So maybe this is a dead-end direction. We try to imitate some things in Ukraine, but we do not change the essence of things. And we should overcome this feudalism. We need a civilized market and land market, and also we should have jury in courts, and it should be done, but many people do not want this, and Ukrainians do not want to accept that they live under feudalism and people do business in the system, and those who are in power also support this, and even to fight in wars is better in feudalism, and this is all bad for democracy. And I believe that maybe we should look at this issue in a more global way.
Буквально в двух словах, I'll briefly translate what was said. Ukraine can be viewed as a neo-feudalist country, and in this setting, under this circumstances, any reforms can hardly be effective. Does anyone have any comments to that?
An academic research is needed to understand how to move from neo-feudalism to neo-capitalism, I believe.
Any other comments?
My short answer would be no. A slightly longer answer would be yes, Ukraine has certain sectors which have been monopolized, and obviously and that in turn results in, I think Andreas Umland talks about neo-patronal politics in Ukraine. But there is a large and significant other sector where companies emerge, develop products, finance them, produce them, sell them in a perfectly normal small, medium enterprise manner. That includes, for example, those that are in the stable of whether it's Dragon or whether it's Western NIS or Horizon and others. So the non-existence of normal capitalism is not something that I can see, and I also see that the existence of significant companies, whether it's in the agricultural sector and some of the others, also transparent companies that are perfectly capable of attracting significant Western fund investors are out there. So yes, there are segments of the Ukrainian economy that need cleaning up. Those are the ones particularly that suffer from oligopoly and monopolization. But no, the entire country is not sunk in neo-feudalism.
Thank you. Any other comments from any of the capitals? One more question, please. In English, please, and as concisely as possible.
Дякую. Леонід Хомяков.
Leonid Khomyakov, Institute of Systemic Analysis. In Ukraine,
and there is external. I think that so far direction of the West as to Russian misdeeds. I like to say mild rebuking against harsh blackmailing. And if it will go on, I believe that all the macroeconomic aids will disappear like water in sands. So can we expect that West will demonstrate more strong reaction on the Russian misbehavior? Thank you.
Thank you. And any comments to that?
I think the Western reaction to Russian aggression has been pretty strong. On the part of the U.S., we have spent more than $2.8 billion since 2014 on security and other assistance to Ukraine, helping it defend its territory and rebuild an economy that can be more resilient to the types of Russian mischief that we see all the time. I think that pertinent to the other question about why are we still in Ukraine, Russian aggression is a key aspect of that, of course. We want Ukraine to be strong. We want it to be able to defend its territorial integrity, and we want a partner in this part of the world. So the U.S., I can only speak for my own country, but the U.S. is deeply committed to Ukraine and will remain so. And we are constantly exploring new avenues of pushing back on Russian aggression, whether it's in cybersecurity, maritime domain awareness because of the recent aggression in the Sea of Azov, sanctions for all sorts of Russian perfidy that happen on a daily basis. So it may not be to the extent that a lot of people would like to see, but the continuity of strong reactions to Russian aggression, I think, is something that we can be proud of.
Thank you. And we have one more comment from Vasyl Babich, RPR Head of International Relations in UN.
Good morning and good evening, everybody. I would be very brief. In 2 weeks, on 27th of February, we within the RPR team are going to have public discussion with presidential candidates. And as we talk today, not only about the reforms, but elections, my question to the speakers is, what would be a single question or advice or recommendation to presidential candidates? What would you personally would like to ask them or advise them? Just one thing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vasyl. That's probably a question to everyone of the speakers.
My one question would be, how would you arrange your affairs and your relationships with your inner core of supporters and advisors to ensure that impunity is overcome?
My advice would be to be very careful about the alliances you build as you take power. Because it seems like those alliances are often the things that drag people back into the past.
Hlib, would you like to?
Yeah, my advice will be the advice that was given, like I'm not a doctor, but like people say that was given by Hippocrates. Do not make harm, do not destroy what was built during these 5 years, at least this will be good.
Don't make it worse.
No, yeah, do not make it worse.
Andrii?
I'll try to be a bit tricky because a couple of weeks ago, VSCI and more than 20 other civic society organizations, we formed a list of 4 questions for the presidential candidates. I'll just be brief that it's reboot of the NACP, problem with management of SAPO, how to choose a new one, protection of NABO and giving them more mandate, and the problems with state security service of Ukraine, specifically with their department which fighting with corruption. So my question would be how and when they will answer these questions and how they will follow the solution for these problems, because I'm sure they're aware of them. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Jill Sinclair, do you have any comments to that? We cannot hear you.
We can't hear you.
The sound is not on.
I would pick up on something that Peter Wagner said, I think, and the message would be, as long as you are continuing on the reform path, we are with you.
Thank you. Peter, do you have your question or advice to the candidates?
Question. With which people, structures, and means do you want to change the situation in the country for the better? And are you sure that it are the people, structure, and means which the people will also still like in 2 to 3 years' time?
Thank you. I guess that's all we have from the Ukrainian audience. We don't have more questions, so we're back to Washington now.
Great, thank you. I want to just turn to Oris first, and then we're gonna wrap up because I think we're right at the top of the hour.
Thanks very much for your comments. I just wanted to add to the whole question of support for Ukraine and build on something, well, a number of you talked about, including Pam. And I'm saying this from my perch as, you know, having worked with the U.S. government for the Helsinki Commission, which is sort of congressional executive branch agency for many decades, and part of my portfolio was Ukraine. But I am very confident of continued U.S. support for Ukraine, not only coming from the executive branch, notwithstanding some of the rhetoric of the current president and whatnot, but also because support for Ukraine enjoys broad bipartisan political support. And it's been consistent. And I think as long as reform efforts are being made, and there's an understanding that these things take time, they don't happen overnight, okay? But as long as things are moving forward, there will continue to be support, and also because of Russia's aggression. There's a lot of goodwill towards Ukraine in the United States, and I'm confident that will be continue. And for example, just yesterday, a important Senate resolution, bipartisan, was introduced calling for greater sanctions and other measures against Russia for a number of its activities, including its aggression in Ukraine. So.
Thank you. I just wanted to make sure we're going to close. It's 11 o'clock here, and obviously at the top of the hour where you are as well, late in Kiev and getting later also as well in Brussels. Bruno, is there any final thoughts on your end in Brussels?
I think we're all impressed by the answers that were given, so we're good here in Brussels. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Olena, on your end, any parting and closing thoughts?
Yes, I would like to, of course, thank you, all of our speakers and our 4 audiences in all the 4 capitals for participating today. We very much rely on your support, the support of the international partners, and we very much ask you to continue monitoring the developments in Ukraine, not only the election-related ones, but also the Ukraine's compliance with its international commitments, reform commitments. We plan to hold another teleconference event in this project in March, prior to the elections, and hope to hear from the leadership of the Central Election Commission and the key international and national organizations monitoring elections, primarily OSCE and Chestnut Movement and the Opora civil network. So we encourage you to join. I'm moving to a new job, but my colleagues at RPR will continue working on this project, and I will contribute to the events as well. To keep you up to date between the sessions, we encourage you to sign up to our newsletter and to contact us anytime when you have any inquiries about the developments in Ukraine. We'd be happy to put you in touch with the experts in your area of interest. Thank you very much again for participating, and we look forward to seeing you at our future events. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I just, again, want to thank all of our speakers as well for joining us. I think you can see in some respects, this is one of those moments where there's a true transatlantic angle to working with Ukraine. I agree with everything Oris has said as well. And obviously, we're going to continue to keep working, and we hope that you'll be able to participate. There are readouts of our events as well. And this is being live streamed at the same time. So a lot of participation. We also thank Ottawa for joining too. And for all the participation, look forward to the Reform Conference as well in the summer, which is going to be critical. But I also, just before leaving, to thank Olena for being an extraordinary partner for us in Washington, in Brussels. Your leadership has been critical. We wish you the best as you move forward, but we know that we'll continue to be able to work with you. And I hope Oris and myself will also be election observers for different organizations coming out. We hope to see you when we come out there, but really just to thank you in RPR and for partners on the ground, Ukrainian civil society. You're in the busiest part of of the work that you're doing, I know, and you've been going, with such speed over the last 4 years. I'm sure waiting at some moment to catch your breath, but thank you so much. But Olena, thank you, because you've really been critical to us launching this process. If I could just give you a round of applause for all you've done. Thank you to everyone. Have a good evening, good morning, and good afternoon for wherever. Happy Valentine's Day too. We heart reform. That was the best line of today. Thank you.